Scary Good. Welcome to Daily Dogman on the Scary Good NYC channel. Today we've got another chapter of our continuing serial called Bryan's Lycan Troubles. But I've been getting comments privately from people saying they're unsure which videos to watch in order to be able to follow the whole story. So I've decided to compile everything so far into this one video, then put our new chapter after the compilation. If you've never seen one of these episodes before, then this is the best video to start from because you can binge watch the backstory before watching the new show. If you've already seen the previous episodes, then you can jump to the time that I hope I remember to post on the screen right there. And now, without further ado, I present to you Bryan's Lycan Troubles, the story so far. First of all, I want to say this episode was requested by Megan Mithshali, the leader of our marshmallows and sing-alongs in our morning YouTube premieres. Megan wants to hear a werewolf story, so that's what we've got today. Hey, have you been watching us long enough to remember the I Was a Teenage Lycan episode? I don't know if I ever put that one back online after everything got deleted, did I? Or did I? I'm not even sure. Well, anyway, this new storyline has nothing to do with that one. This is a story I've got a number of chapters for, so I might do part 2 of this either if any of you like it, or if I just feel like it later on. You should know that I have no idea who the anonymous person is who claims that this is their real life. Now, the first teenage Lycan who wrote to us is female, but this one is a guy. He claims he's 21 now, but these are stories about when he was a teenager and first began changing into a werewolf-type creature. Now, he and the previous story submitter both use this term Lycan, L-Y-C-A-N. It seems to come from the Underworld series of films. I hope it's not their registered trademark or anything. Basically, it means lycanthrope or werewolf, so although fans of Underworld might argue with me, they are essentially the same thing. And since the protagonist in this allegedly true story arc is the only werewolf in it, at least through most of the narrative, he's also the only Lycan and lycanthrope in Dogman. So in the reality of these stories, all these words mean the same thing. Okay, he uses a name when writing to me that's very theatrical. I'm just gonna call him Bryan. Bryan was a normal kid who really wanted to be different. He didn't understand that all the different kids spent their days being picked on and wishing they could be normal. Bryan tried to find ways to be different, but he didn't really have an original bone in his body. He was a nice kid, but he was very average and very predictable. He loved the team that it was most normal for him to love in his area. He got average grades. He held average opinions. He had a really cool cat named Mervin that he loved a lot, so he was okay and he was a good guy, but other than Mervin, it would be hard to pick Bryan out of a crowd of other boys his age. Getting fed up with himself, Bryan decided to do something uncharacteristic. Anything uncharacteristic. He decided to take a walk into the forest, armed with nothing but his backpack full of trail mix and his cell phone that he figured he could watch YouTube survival tutorials on whenever he didn't know what to do. So, at the tender age of 15, our hero wandered off into the woods where he became lost in less than an hour. Yes, the woods, where there is rarely any shelter, there is never any Wi-Fi, and sometimes predators roam. So, young Bryan suddenly learned that being unique isn't always the fun it's cracked up to be as he began shivering. He hadn't brought anything to keep himself warm with that night. His backpack had trail mix in it, but nothing else useful. He tried to search for a YouTube video on how to start a fire from rubbing sticks together, but there was no Wi-Fi. He began searching around in a panicked way for twigs and dry wood, but anything he could find was damp from recent bad weather. Then, on top of everything else, it began to rain. Bryan ran, not knowing quite what else to do. The rain was pouring down through the tall trees. It took longer to hit the ground, but came at you from various directions at once, and in varying amounts of water. He ran through mist, punctuated with rain, and occasional streams like little air rivers coming down from above. Bryan searched desperately for shelter, and then it was there, right in front of him. At least he thought it was, but the rain was coming down so hard that he couldn't be sure. Running through dirt which was quickly becoming slippery mud, Bryan slid, feet first, into the small entrance of a cave. Panting and catching his breath, Bryan opened his backpack and had a snack, watching the rain come down in front of him like a widescreen 3D movie. Well, at least today was different from any other day, thought Bryan, who then descended into tears, realizing that he might never find his way out and might never see his family or friends or his cat Mervyn ever again. So Bryan cried himself to sleep in the little cave entrance, and when he woke up, it was still raining. Now he needed to relieve himself, but it was still too miserable outside for him to want to go out in that weather. Turning around, he noticed for the first time that this cave wasn't just a shallow depression in the rock. It was a small entrance to a vast cave system. Climbing down the rocks, he found himself in a tunnel tall enough that he could easily stand in it. Although mostly natural, it appeared to be carved away in places to make it easier to walk through. He wondered why this wasn't a public attraction. It had clearly been tooled by man. How could something like this just exist, abandoned in the woods? He wondered who had chiseled out the walls in the places it wasn't natural. How long ago had the work been done? And for what purpose? Was this leading into a mine? Bryan was thinking a lot of questions, but how to get back out without getting lost was not one of them. Finding himself in a small area naturally cut out of the rock, Bryan realized he still had to relieve himself. There was a corner, sort of shaped like a urinal, and Bryan, being a creature of habit, used that to do his duty. While in the midst of said activity, however, he saw something that caused him to do something he had never done before and would never do again. And after all, wasn't that the original point of this entire exercise? So what Bryan saw when he shone his camera flashlight and gazed into a dark corner of the cave system was eye shine. Bright yellow eye shine where there shouldn't have been any. And why didn't his flashlight illuminate the creature connected to those eyes? So what Bryan did that night, for the first and only time in his life, was Bryan ran before remembering to pull his pants back up. I'm sure it was not a pretty sight, and he ended up tangled in his own clothing on the floor, trying to fix himself and get up at the same time. While all this was happening and panic was gripping the boy, the two yellow eyes started moving closer to Bryan. Watching the eyes instead of what he was doing, Bryan wept openly. This couldn't be happening. This was not something that actually happened. Finally adjusted, Bryan ran back toward the entrance of the cave, but whatever was behind him took off in pursuit. Bryan ran as fast as he could, yet he felt certain he was a goner. He had always been one of the slowest runners in every grade of school. He flinched as he ran, expecting hands from behind to grip him at any second. They never did. Instead, claws came down on him, hard. It didn't feel nice, and Bryan screamed. He screamed like a wounded animal because, at that moment, that's exactly what he was. Crawling on his belly, Bryan could see the light of the cave entrance. Then, teeth bit hard into his ankle, and reacting in shock, Bryan kicked hard with the other foot, knocking the creature free from his foot. Looking now and seeing the animal for the first time, he was stunned to see that it was some kind of a dog, but a mutated monster sort of a dog. The thing reared up on its hind legs, but it didn't go back down. Screaming in utter horror, a rush of adrenaline gripped Bryan and he raced out of the cave entrance and ran directly into a searcher party that had been called out after his parents reported him missing. The searchers hugged and comforted Bryan, who screamed at the top of his lungs that there was a werewolf pursuing him and they all had to run. The searchers humored Bryan and they all began their egress from the forest while rehydrating him and investigating him for injuries. He told them he had been scratched and bitten by a monster Dogman. His clothes were indeed torn in the areas he pointed to, but there were no wounds on his body. Bryan did not understand how this could be. He noticed they no longer hurt either. The injuries now just no longer existed. Bryan was so relieved to think that maybe he had imagined the entire episode that he passed out right on the spot. Bryan's parents felt intense guilt about what he had done, and after he came back they doted on him, seeing to his every need and trying to make certain he felt special and unique. Bryan was happier than he'd ever been in his life, and he was glad that he had gone into the forest that day. Everything had turned out for the better after all. Then, the next month, on the night of the full moon, Bryan's opinion about his little adventure changed drastically. Part 2. Even Bryan himself accepted that he must have imagined or hallucinated the werewolf. Maybe there was some kind of gas in that cave that caused him to see things. His parents were so grateful to have him home safe that they treated him like a king, and Bryan settled into his new normal easily. It was safe to say that he had never been so happy before. That next month, though, on the morning of the second day of the full moon, Bryan awoke at his usual time, but not in his usual place. Rolling over, he almost fell out of the tree he had been sleeping in. After gaining a more secure hold on the branch he was laying on, adrenaline helped him to get his bearings, and he could see he was 20 or more feet above the ground, just a few feet outside his bedroom window, which fortunately was open. He was wearing his boxers, but that's all. Climbing carefully and slowly, shaking all over from the sudden shock of the situation, and possibly a bit from exposure, Bryan made his way back into his bedroom and collapsed to the floor, panting. It wasn't that the climb had been such a physical effort, it was the panic about what might have happened if he slipped. Being a teenager, Bryan was nearly as worried about what his parents would do and what the neighbors and other kids might say if he was found unconscious in his boxers in his mother's flower garden, as he was worried about getting injured. But he was back inside and nobody had seen him, so nothing to worry about. He had dodged a bullet. He kept his eyes shut and allowed his breathing to slow down on its own. He put his cheek to the thick carpeting in his room and reassured himself that he was safe and everything was okay. Finally calming down, Bryan took a look around his room and saw that everything was thrown all over the place. Thrusting right back into panic mode, he checked his computer and other electronics, and none of them were broken. It really looked worse than it was. Quickly putting everything back in its proper place, Bryan began to worry about what he had done the night before and why he couldn't remember any of it. He definitely had not had anything to drink or whatever. He had lemonade with dinner, then played video games in his room until he must have fallen asleep at some point, but all he could remember was playing the game, then waking up in the tree outside. He saw the time and bolted up to get ready for school, then remembered it was Saturday and laughed at himself for not being able to calm down. Checking his phone, he found there were a number of texts from this girl that lived nearby named Jenny. Jenny was sort of an ex-girlfriend of Bryan's, although not exactly. They once had It's Complicated on their Facebook because of each other, but it never progressed further than that. After sort of breaking up, they sort of stayed friends. Neither of them had ever been introduced to each other's family or inner circle, so they could share secrets with each other that they knew nobody else they knew would ever hear about. When Bryan saw Jenny's texts asking him to come over and have breakfast with her and her mom, he accepted right away. It would be a good way to distract himself from whatever he might have done the night before, which he no longer wanted to think about. When Bryan got to Jenny's, it turned out she really just wanted to get him alone to talk. So he said hi to her mom, who, as I mentioned earlier, he had never met before, grabbed some food for himself, and they went up to her room. Bryan noticed that Jenny seemed really upset, and as soon as he was sure her mom wasn't listening, he asked her what was wrong. Feeling safe with him, Jenny cried quietly for a little while, and Bryan braced for something really heavy. When she finally was composed enough to talk again, though, what she said to him made him chuckle. What she told him was that last night she had seen a monster. I thought this was going to be something really serious, he told her, and Jenny grew dark quickly. Bryan had never been in Jenny's bedroom before. He'd actually never been in any girl's bedroom before, so he was a bit giddy. He was already planning out how to exaggerate the event to impress his friends. "It is serious," she insisted. "This thing chased me, and I almost didn't get away." Sobering up quickly, Bryan wiped the smirk off his face and asked her to explain what happened. She said she was walking home from her friend Erin's place, and it was around 9:45 or 10. She reminded him about the overgrown alleyway they used to go to when they wanted to hang out alone, the one with the wall on one side and the forest on the other, just barely wide enough for two people to walk through side by side. Of course, Bryan remembered. She said she was walking through there when the thing came out of the woods on one side of it, and she took off running the rest of the way home. Bryan stopped her and asked her to explain what she saw. He needed her to describe what she meant when she said she saw a monster. "Well, it was large," she began, "larger than any man I've ever seen. Like a basketball player and a football player would look small on either side of this guy. He was covered in fur, which was dark, with silver highlights." "Was it like a Bigfoot?" asked Bryan, now thoroughly intrigued. "Oh, no," she responded. "It definitely was not a Bigfoot." "How can you be so sure?" he asked. "Because it had a dog-like head," she answered. "It was a werewolf." Bryan's eyes widened in shock. He pulled away from Jenny and studied her intensely. Was she making fun of him? How could she know that he thought he saw a werewolf in that cave? He never told anyone but his parents and the searchers who found him. Did she know one of the searchers? Jenny saw Bryan looking at her strangely, but she didn't understand what the meaning of his expression was. Are you kidding me? Bryan asked, feeling a bit paranoid. Why would I kid you? Asked Jenny, growing more concerned. Bryan seemed really upset, and she didn't understand why. He pulled her close to him and whispered in her ear. Did you know that I saw that same thing? He asked so quietly that even the NSA had a hard time hearing him. Jenny looked Bryan deep in his eyes and shook her head. No, she didn't know that. Beginning to suspect that she may have really seen the same monster that he saw, Bryan asked her to back up to the beginning and tell him every single detail she could remember in order. And so she did. The monster jumped out of the trees behind her. She turned and looked at it, and she made the mistake of looking it directly in its eye. The immense man-beast became enraged and lunged for her. She ran home, and it chased her, swiping at her and growling but barely missing each time. When she got to her block, which is lit with streetlights, the creature hung back in the darkness and didn't come any closer. She said she could see that it was still there just before she went inside and double-locked the door behind her. The entire incident had unnerved Jenny, and Bryan felt badly about that. When she asked him if he could come with her to her friend Erin's that night so he could walk her home safely, he agreed without a second thought. The two girls were working on a school project together, but they said he could use Erin's brother's gaming system in another room while they worked, so he had no reason to say no. Walking home from Jenny's, Bryan started wondering if he was starting to have feelings for Jenny again, or if she was maybe starting to have feelings for him. Then again, it might just be a friend thing. He was so wrapped up in those kinds of thoughts that he wasn't thinking at all anymore about why he had woken up in a tree that morning. Come 4:45 p.m., Bryan showed up at Jenny's front door exactly on time to walk her to her friend's place. Jenny's mom made noises about how she liked a responsible young man, and Bryan felt very welcome there. As the two walked along through the suburban streets, they arrived at the alley. This is where it happened? Bryan asked. Yep, this is where, she responded. We can go around the long way if you're scared to go down there. It's kind of a long way to go with no left or right turns if that thing jumps out at us again. I'm not scared, Bryan told her indignantly, then began strolling down the alleyway, trying not to betray the fact that he was in fact scared to death to be there. Jenny tried to lighten the moment. My dad tells me that anytime I'm scared, I should think of something funny, and I just thought of something funny that I actually forgot to tell you. What's that? Asked Bryan, trying to sound brave as he scanned the trees for any slight movement. Jenny continued, That monster I told you about. Bryan flinched. The last thing he wanted to talk about in Monster Alley was the predatory monster with a wolf head that lived there. What about it? Asked Bryan. Well, Jenny went on, he was for some reason. She broke off and covered her mouth as she giggled. Bryan was confused. What about the werewolf she saw was funny? There was nothing funny about the werewolf when he saw it. When she could. Jenny went on. The werewolf, she said. The werewolf? It was wearing underpants. And she went back to laughing. Bryan's leg went down as it had with each of his prior steps, but this time when his foot met the ground, Bryan's knee had turned to jelly and could no longer support his weight. Bryan went down like a sack of potatoes. His mind had gone into overload. The werewolf was wearing underpants? Jenny hadn't seen the werewolf he had seen. She had seen something quite different. She had seen Bryan. Bryan looked up at Jenny, who looked back with concern on her face. Bryan felt his blood boil as he tried to speak to her, but found that he could no longer control his vocal cords or tongue. He felt an intensity of physical experience beyond description, and then In an instant, Bryan wasn't there any longer.
I hear there's a celebrity with the initials GG appearing at the next Northeast Comic-Con.
Is it Gina Gershon?
What? No.
Is it Greg Grumberg?
Greg which?
Greta Garbo?
Bryan's Lycan Troubles, Part 3. Bryan woke up in a strange room. It had featureless concrete walls and one door. Sitting up, he realized he was on a mat on the floor with a single blanket over him. He saw a 1 foot by 6 inch drain in one corner and what must have been an air vent near the ceiling in one of the other corners. He was fully clothed, but his clothes were torn in places. His shoes were nearby and he quickly put them on. Getting up and running to the door, Bryan pushed and pulled on it and turned the doorknob frantically, but he couldn't get it to budge. He was locked in a concrete cell. Turning around, he saw one more feature of this place that sent his heart pumping even faster. There was a heavy chain bolted securely into the ground in one corner, and on the other end of that chain was a clamp large enough to strap around his midsection. What kind of madman was holding him? Without windows, he couldn't even guess at the location or the time of day. Bryan started hyperventilating but fought against it. Not having a paper bag to breathe into, he pulled his shirt up over his face and sat down on the bed, trying to relax so he could remember how he got there. Bryan could hear something sliding on the other side of the door and braced himself that his abductor might be about to reveal himself. Oddly, he could swear he heard a girl giggling mixed in with the sounds of bolts being unlocked. He pulled his shirt down off his head and over his torso, just in time to see the bright light of morning streaming through the door so brightly that it blinded him. Squinting, he watched as in through that glare walked the heavenly form of a beautiful young woman, all dolled up in a designer summer dress and elaborate yet understated makeup. The angelic form giggled at him and asked him if wearing your shirt over your face was a new kind of meditation practice. That angel sure sounded like his friend Jenny. Standing, Bryan was surprised to find it actually was Jenny. Nothing was making sense. Why was Jenny here? Why was she dressed like this? Why was she collaborating with his abductors? Why was she holding him against his will? Well, it turns out the answers to those questions are a bit mundane. 1. She was dressed like that to go to brunch with her mom and her mom's rich lady friends that she was always trying to impress. 2. She wasn't collaborating with his abductors. She said she had invited him there the night before, and he had accepted. 3. She wasn't holding him against his will. The door was open and he was free to go. And so Jenny told him she'd explain more after brunch, and they made plans to meet by the forest alley at 3 p.m. so she could fill him in. Then she was off like a sprite flying into the forest. Bryan was more confused than ever. He was confused about what happened. He was confused about where he was. And he was confused about his feelings for Jenny. He had never seen her dressed up before, and in his defense, he was at the age when hormones run out of control. So let's just say Bryan's head was spinning. Leaving the room, he discovered a short hallway and a stairway leading up to the brightly lit kitchen. Finding his way out of there, Bryan left through the back door and began to walk home. What had happened the night before? He remembered he had gone out. Where had he gone? That's right, he went to meet Jenny at the alley. What happened after that? He vaguely remembered being there. They had a conversation. What happened next? Had he been drugged somehow? If he had, was it by Jenny? It must have been, but why would she do that? And how could she do it if they were both in the alley? It's not like he was drinking something that she could slip something into. Bryan froze in his tracks. Wait, he was supposed to meet her at 3 in the alley. That was the same place she had drugged him. Well, she might have drugged him the day before. Was it actually safe to meet up with her again? In the same place? When he got home, Bryan expected to get shouted at by his mother about not having come home or called the night before. Instead, she had breakfast waiting for him and smiles. She asked him if he felt better. Better than what? He asked back. That was when his mom informed him that she had been in touch with Jenny's mom since the afternoon prior, and that Jenny's mom had told her she was watching Bryan because he had fallen ill while out walking with her daughter. I fell ill? Bryan asked, mulling the idea over in his head. Could that be what happened? Or was that a story to cover up that Jenny and her mom had drugged and abducted him? If they had kidnapped him, though, why would they have released him the next morning? On the other hand, if he had been sick, why would they lock him in a windowless basement with a security door? Yes, dear, you fell ill, said Bryan's mom, pouring him a large glass of orange juice. Drink that, it helps your immune system. Bryan tried to form words to explain to his mother that he didn't understand what was happening. She could see the confusion in his eyes and told him that Jenny and her mom would explain everything when Bryan went back to their place later. This was news to Bryan. I'm going back there? To that dungeon? Well, you know, Jenny's mother is a doctor of some sort, and she says you have a rare disorder. That was all Bryan's mom needed to know, that someone was a doctor. After that, she would trust them blindly, and she expected her son to as well. Technically, Bill Cosby is a doctor, thought Bryan. He wasn't as sure about all this as his mom was. Of course, she could still remember what happened to her the night before. At 3 p.m., Bryan was back at the alley, but he was nervous and wary. Jenny was nowhere to be seen. He was about to leave 10 minutes later when she showed up, changed back into her jeans. Bryan kept backing away from her as she approached. He wanted to keep her at more than arm's length in case she really did have some way to drug him. Maybe she used a poison dart or something, he didn't know. All Bryan knew about poison and drugs was what he had seen in old movies. He kept his eyes on her the entire time, eyeing her warily and watching where she put her hands and arms. This was all funny to Jenny, his sudden fear of her. You don't know how ironic it is, she told him, that you're the one scared of me. What's that supposed to mean? He asked angrily. I'm not the one kidnapping people and trapping them in medieval dungeons. Jenny laughed at his description and told him that her family calls that cell the Lion Room. It seems that back 50 years ago, or whenever the place was owned by this eccentric guy before them, he actually used to have some kind of a big cat that he kept illegally. Usually it was kept in that room, but sometimes he would bring it out for parties or whatever. A terrible thing to do to a wild animal. But this was a long time ago. So that was the explanation for the rusty old chain and clamp. It once went around the poor lion's neck, or tiger, or whatever it was that was actually kept down there. All that sort of made sense to Bryan, but how he got there and why he didn't remember the details, those were things that did not make sense to Bryan. Look, she began, I'm just going to tell you the truth, and I don't care if you believe me. That got Bryan's attention, and he shut up and listened. Jenny related a tale of them meeting at this exact spot the day before, upon which Bryan had a seizure. He fell to the ground, and Jenny rushed to his side to prop his head up and prevent him from choking. It turned out she didn't need to do anything of the kind. He wasn't choking. He was transforming. Transforming? Asked Bryan incredulously. How stupid do you think I am? Jenny scowled and interrupted him, reminding him that she had warned ahead of time that she didn't care to hear his opinion of the truth she was telling him. Okay, Bryan relented. Let's hear your weird fairy tale. What did I transform into? A fairy prince? Hardly, she shot back. full on glaring at him. They both looked so furious at each other at that moment, you might have mistaken them for a married couple. Bryan promised to let her tell her story without interruptions if he could have a long question and answer period after the lecture. So Jenny continued her narrative. The two of them had been talking and walking through the forested alley when Bryan seemed to have a seizure and fell to the ground. Jenny, as she said before, held his head in her hands and was concerned about him swallowing his own tongue. But as she saw up close, the herky-jerky movements he was exhibiting were in response to a sudden, radical shifting of his bones and internal organs. His body was literally reorganizing itself in front of her. She said he grew hair all over, and his face grew outward. In places, his clothes ripped where they could no longer contain his now larger form. In other places, they sagged, as he was much thinner in some places as well. His shoes just fell off, and Jenny told him she put them in her shoulder bag and later put them in the cell with him. Bryan said, "Stop. Tell me exactly what I looked like. You say I was a werewolf? What does that mean?" Jenny stopped and thought. "Well, you were very tall. You told me that already. You had hair all over. You told me that already. Your face protruded like that of a dog or a wolf. Go on. Your eyes seemed strange. They were yellow and orange and seemed to almost be lit from within." Bryan rolled his eyes, not even believing what she was saying anymore. "Your ears stood on end like a Doberman's, but taller. You were shaggier than a Doberman, but dark, colored brown and black all over." Bryan realized he couldn't tell if she was telling the truth or not, so it was a pointless line of inquiry. Bryan wanted to know what happened in between him supposedly turning into a monster and her putting him and his shoes in her mysterious sub-basement detainment center. Jenny said the transformation was unlike anything she'd ever seen on TV and that Bryan's body was flailing around. She prevented him from falling and hurting himself a few times during the process until he seemed to fully accept her assistance. When he was finally transformed into the werewolf, Jenny claimed he stood possibly 8 feet tall, but he seemed exhausted from the transformation, and he leaned a bit on her as he caught his breath. "Wait, so I acted tame toward you?" Bryan asked suspiciously. "Aren't werewolves supposed to kill the ones they love?" "You think I love you?" asked Jenny, laughing out loud. She laughed a little too long and a little too loud for Bryan's taste, and his feelings got hurt. Jenny could see this, so she cut the laughter and put on her oopsie face. "Oh, I'm sorry, Bryan." "There's nothing to be sorry about," snarled Bryan. "I didn't say I love you. Who said that? Nobody said that. That's who said that. Nobody." "Right," agreed Jenny, realizing she had to be a little more sensitive about Bryan's feelings than she thought she had to be. Bryan tried to get back on topic. "If I was a werewolf or whatever, why didn't I rip you to shreds?" he asked. Jenny giggled again. "Why would you do that to me?" she asked. Bryan just stared at her blankly. She was insane. Probably her and her mother both. And maybe Bryan's mother too, since she seemed to be in on the whole thing. Bryan went over her story again. He, supposedly, changed into an 8-foot-tall werewolf while still wearing his clothes, then calmly walked home with her to her house with nobody seeing them. Then she locked him in her basement and he didn't complain and he went to sleep. That's the story? Jenny started explaining how she used to have a large dog she grew up with, but her father took it in the divorce, and she just likes large dogs, so she had no fear of Bryan. Bryan realized she had just described him as a large dog. That's what he was to her, both figuratively and now, according to her crazy story, literally as well. This was why they had never really fully become boyfriend and girlfriend, and kept sliding back into just friends. To her, he was just sort of a pet. And now, she literally wanted to cage him like that eccentric homeowner before her had chained up a wild animal in his basement. He told her no. Jenny ignored Bryan and began describing how she had installed a video camera in the air vent, which had a wide-angle view of the entire cell. If he spent the night there as she requested, then he could watch the video in the morning for himself, and he would either have proof that Jenny was telling the truth, or he would know for sure that she was a liar, and he could cut her off then if he wanted. Bryan had to admit, that seemed like an interesting idea. His mom had the address where he was going to be, so if he didn't come home in the morning, she would probably start the process of calling people to get him out. And there was the other issue of how Bryan had come to be wearing nothing but his underpants on a tree branch outside his window the night before this all happened. Whether Jenny was telling the truth or lying, something very strange was going on, and Bryan had grown intensely curious about what was happening during these blackout periods that he couldn't remember. And so, he consented to go with Jenny to be locked in her basement like an animal. All Bryan knows for sure is that he's been experiencing blackouts and waking up in strange locations with his clothes either torn or missing. He isn't sure whether he should trust Jenny or her intellectual but eccentric PhD mom. Jenny offers to videotape him at night in her basement cell so that he can witness the transformation for himself. As we rejoin the story, Bryan has just arrived with the blessing of his mother at Jenny's place to be locked in the cellar like an animal for the night. He brought his school books, planning on doing homework, but Jenny's mom said he shouldn't take anything in there that he wouldn't want to see get torn up. She let him take one of her old paperbacks with him to read instead, kissing it goodbye dramatically before handing it to him. Bryan wondered out loud how these two women came to think that having a werewolf in their house was such a funny thing. He didn't really believe that he was a werewolf, and he wasn't sure these two did either. To be honest, Bryan still wasn't sure which way was up or down. Jenny argued with her mom for a while, not wanting to put Bryan in the basement until he needed to go. She pleaded, "Let me keep him a little while longer," to her mom the way a kid would plead to get to keep a puppy. Somehow, Bryan wasn't charmed. He said he didn't mind going downstairs early. Jenny was having none of it. She grabbed him by the arm and dragged him to the stairs toward her room, reminding both of them that Bryan was tame, at least for her. It was strange how the more nice things Jenny said about him, the worse it made Bryan feel. When they got up to her room, her phone rang, and it was a guy. She kept talking to him even though she had a guest in her room, so Bryan made his break for it and went back downstairs. He asked Jenny's mom to lock him in the basement and set up the camera, then he settled down on the mattress and got lost in the paperback he had been given to read. When he woke up, Bryan looked around, and everything seemed pretty normal. The paperback book was lying next to the mattress, still in its original condition. He grabbed it and checked the door, which had been unlocked as promised. Bryan once again was blinded by the sunlight streaming down the kitchen stairs onto the white walls outside his cell. Shielding his eyes, he made his way up, guided by the smell of breakfast cooking. Declaring triumphantly that he was right, they were crazy, and he had never changed into a werewolf. Both of the women giggled. They sat Bryan in front of a small video monitor and showed him a hard-to-make-out, black and white video image. "Wait," asked Bryan, "is that me? In the room downstairs? I can hardly tell with the quality of this video." He inquired where they had managed to find a black and white video camera anyway. They explained it was a leftover from the security camera system that the previous owner had installed. Fast forwarding to the part where he changed, Bryan got to watch an incredibly blurry version of himself growing a long snout, growing hair, growing tall ears, and just growing in general. Even at such extreme low resolution, it was an awful lot to digest. When the video was over, the three of them just sat there. Then, Bryan hit the rewind button. "You want to watch it again?" asked Jenny. "No," answered Bryan. "I want to rewind to find out where you made the cut." They didn't know what he meant by cut, so Bryan explained that he wanted to find the spot where they cut him out and cut the actor in doing his werewolf act. The two women rolled their eyes and went about their day, leaving Bryan to watch the video as many times as he needed to until he finally accepted what had actually happened. When Jenny got back around sunset, she found Bryan still there, still staring at the video. He seemed to have come around though, and he apologized for not believing them earlier. He asked if he could stay over again that night, but Jenny told him there are only 3 nights of the full moon that he has to be concerned with, and that he should have a normal night that night and every night until the next full moon the following month. Bryan asked if he could stay one more night anyway, just in case, with the video left on, and they agreed, so he did. But nothing happened, and he went home in the morning, relieved to not have to deal with this for another few weeks at least. With acceptance of the reality of his situation came a new round of questions and worries for Bryan. What about a cure? Is there a cure for what ailed him? At least it was only 3 days a month, but it was still a huge, exhausting thing to have to deal with, especially if it was going to have to last the rest of his life. He realized how lucky he was that Jenny had dealt with all this for him. If she hadn't, he wondered what horrible things he might have already done. And so things sort of went back to normal, or found a new normal for the next few days, and Bryan took to hanging around Jenny's house, reading her mom's books about lycanthropy, curses, shapeshifters, and everything even vaguely related to what happened to him. And then Jenny's mom would send him out with Jenny to walk around and talk and become better friends. One night, Jenny didn't come home, and her mom explained that she had a date. It was a date with a kid Bryan knew, a kid that actually used to pick on him at school, a rich kid who was also a jock and good at everything Bryan was bad at. As usual, the best man won. He shouldn't have been surprised, but Bryan took it very hard. He had no right to be jealous, and he knew that. He told himself that. She was just his friend, and she'd been very loyal to him, even placing herself at risk of physical danger to take care of him. She didn't owe him anything more, and he knew that. But still, it hurt to think that she only saw him as her personal pet Dogman and nothing more. Bryan didn't go to Jenny's the next day. He started hanging around Jenny less and less, and within a week he had convinced himself that none of this had really ever happened. His mother still wanted him to go back to Jenny's house when the next full moon came, because, after all, Jenny's mom was a doctor. "She has a doctorate in sociology, Mom," shouted Bryan. His mom finally consented to let him stay at home if he stayed in the guest room. Why the guest room? Because that was the only room in the house that could be locked from the outside. "You're allowed to stay in my home, Bryan," she informed him, "but you're not allowed to kill your mother. Do you understand me?" Bryan said yes, and promised not to kill her. So, the first night of the next full moon arrived, and Jenny pleaded with Bryan to come stay in her basement again. He told her she was batty, and that he would be fine. He said he was only going to sleep in a locked room to humor his mom, but he didn't really believe any of it anymore. He sent Jenny away, and retired to his mini prison. Again, he shouldn't have been surprised. Not at all. He shouldn't have been even slightly surprised when he woke up in a tree he had never even seen before. And he shouldn't have been surprised to find himself wearing nothing but his boxers once again. So, Bryan was found running from bush to bush in a local park, wearing nothing but his boxer shorts, and he got picked up by the police. They delivered him to his mother's door wrapped in a blanket, and he got let off with a warning because his parents were respected members of the local community. Once the officers left, both Bryan's mother and father tore into him. He had a feeling they weren't going to be the only ones, as he ached from bruises all over his body and had no memory of how he ended up in the park in the first place. Already, he deeply regretted having dismissed Jenny when she offered him a safe place to sleep last night. Nothing would have happened if he had only swallowed his pride and stayed in her mother's basement instead of the guest room here, which he obviously had found a way to get out of. Bryan started to ask his parents how he got out, but before he could finish asking the question, his father dragged him upstairs to show him personally how he got out. Bryan figured this wasn't going to be anything good, and it wasn't. One of the windows in the bedroom was completely smashed out. He must have jumped straight through it. The frame itself was damaged, not just the glass. Bryan was informed that he would be paying his parents back for the cost of fixing that window. Great. And this day was just getting started. His mother ordered him to call Jenny right away to make arrangements for that night, and Bryan realized he had no other safe place to stay, so he did as his mother asked. But Jenny wouldn't pick up her phone. Bryan tried texting her but still got no response. When he told his mother, she gave him an intense and insulting, hurtful and humiliating lecture, then got on the phone to talk to Jenny's mom. The condescending comments about Bryan did not stop once she got the other mom on the phone either. Bryan's mom started telling Jenny's mom what an idiot her son had been the night before, but it turned out that Jenny's mom had even more interesting information for Bryan's mom. It turns out that Bryan, in his Lycan form, had visited Jenny's house the previous night. Jenny was hanging out on the front porch outside with her new boyfriend Lyle, a guy that used to pick on Bryan at school when they were younger. Out of nowhere, Bryan, in his werewolf form, flew on top of Lyle, and the two of them rolled on the porch in mortal combat for real. Although the battle was ferocious, Lyle kicked Bryan's butt almost as easily as he had years back. Even in his werewolf form, Bryan was no match for Lyle, and he ran off into the night, whimpering, with his tail figuratively between his legs. That might explain at least some of the lumps and bruises he was coping with that morning. But Bryan was confused why these bruises weren't healing by themselves. He had been afraid that he might have killed someone the night before. He should have been relieved that he barely even scratched Jenny's new guy. Lyle's only wound was a single scratch on his cheek, and it was already healed, so Bryan had actually lost the fight. This was strangely disappointing. Bryan had always thought that werewolves were superhuman, that a normal man couldn't defeat one of them. Then he remembered that old Lon Chaney movie. Bela Lugosi, the first werewolf, was killed by Lon Chaney. And then Lon Chaney, this is a spoiler, Lon Chaney gets killed by Frederick March. In both cases, a normal man is able to defeat the monster by striking it with silver. Lyle just punched and kicked, he didn't even use a weapon. Bryan now realized he needed a high-security cell to stay in, more to protect himself than to protect others. He was only going to get himself in trouble or killed. So Bryan's mother was able to negotiate to allow her son to stay in the cell in Jenny's mom's basement for the next 2 nights. But Jenny was no longer speaking to Bryan, and he was told he was not allowed near her or her boyfriend ever again. Bryan was really sad for what he'd done, and he cried, but absolutely not one person in his world cared. They were all very annoyed at him, and more than a little scared of him as well. When his mom dropped Bryan off, he asked her for a hug, and she told him he was a disappointment to her, and for the first time in her life, she regretted having had him. Then she threw his bag onto the curb and ordered him out of her car. Bryan got locked in the cell by Jenny's mom, who didn't even say hello to him. After she left, Bryan cried himself to sleep. And then, when he woke up the next morning, with the sun glaring in his eyes, Bryan realized he could hear birds singing. How could he hear birds from the basement cell? Adrenaline shot through his body and he sat up quickly, almost falling off the branch he was perched on. He had woken up in a tree again. But how? He had been locked in the cell the night before. Bryan took stock of his situation and realized that, although he was barefoot and his clothes were torn, at least he wasn't outside in his underpants again. Climbing down from the tree, he realized he was in someone's backyard. Sneaking as quietly as he could up the driveway, he jumped the front fence and was about to attempt to stroll casually away when one of the residents of the house spotted him and shouted for him to stop. Bryan hit a full run, or as close to a full run as he could manage in his bare feet, and was lucky that the guy at the house was too lazy to run after him. When he got to the corner, Bryan got his bearings and knew where he was. It was about 5 blocks from his home, nowhere near Jenny's place, where he had expected to wake up. When Bryan got home, he realized he didn't have his keys with him, so he was going to have to ring the doorbell and get yelled at by whomever answered. Maybe they wouldn't even answer once they saw it was him. They probably knew more about the night before than he did. Maybe it was over. Maybe they would disown him. Maybe they would hand him over to the police. Maybe he would sleep in a jail cell that night. Bryan was so sad. He couldn't stop the tears from streaming down his cheeks. Well, he thought, I have nothing to lose. So he rang the doorbell. Maybe they'll just throw my stuff out on the sidewalk and kick me out, he thought. The door opened, and his mother, who clearly had been crying, shouted his name and wrapped him in a warm, tight hug. She asked him where he'd been, and he started to tell her he didn't know when she dragged him inside. Suddenly, he was being hugged again by someone else he couldn't even see by whom. It was Jenny. She'd been crying as well. Wow, what happened the night before, he wondered out loud. He begged someone to fill him in on what happened. Do you remember that fight you had with Lyle? Jenny asked, then remembered. Of course he couldn't remember it. He blacks out when he becomes a werewolf. Well, anyway, when you fought him, he got a little scratch. We didn't think anything about it at the time because it healed so quickly. Okay, said Bryan, unsure where this was leading. Well, last night, Jenny continued, I was with Bryan when he started convulsing in that exact same way you had in the alley that time. Wait, Bryan shouted. Lyle is a werewolf too now? Jenny shook her head in the affirmative. He's a werewolf, but a much larger one than you. Far more feral. I couldn't control him. Bryan still didn't understand how he got out of the cell, and Jenny told him. Lyle had been jealous and angry all night that Bryan was in her basement. He wanted to press charges against you, you know, she said, but he couldn't prove that it was you that attacked him, obviously. So, Lyle let me out of the basement? Bryan asked incredulously. He didn't mean to, Jenny answered. He ran downstairs, tore the door open, and you two started fighting. It was unlike anything I had ever seen. Hair was flying all over, and he really tore you up. But the wounds were already starting to heal as you escaped the basement and ran away. So I ran away and he chased me? Bryan asked. That's about the size of it. Bryan's dad told him that Lyle was still missing. He asked if Bryan was together enough to join him in the search team. A number of parents in the neighborhood were going to go out looking for Lyle, and they thought Bryan might have special insight into the sorts of places they might want to look for him. Before he could answer, Bryan's mother screamed. Following her gaze, Bryan looked outside and he screamed too. What they both saw outside that window was some sort of drooling, savage, dog-headed man. It must be Lyle, and he for some reason never changed back. Today's story, Bryan's Lycan troubles get much, much worse. When we last left our hero Bryan, it was the morning of the 3rd day of the full moon. He was in human form back at his parents' house. Jenny and the others were explaining to him that when Bryan, in his Lycan form, had attacked Jenny's new boyfriend Lyle, it had given him the werewolf curse as well. It was Lyle who ran down to Jenny's basement and released the werewolf Bryan, and Lyle was the reason that Bryan woke up bruised in a tree in someone's backyard that morning. He was about to join his father in a search team out looking for the still missing Lyle when Bryan's mom screamed. Everyone turned to see what she was upset about, and there, right outside the window, they all saw a werewolf in broad daylight. It had to be Lyle, but why had he not reverted to human form when the sun came up? Realizing at once that he had larger and more pressing concerns than answering that question, Bryan started barking out orders to the others. He felt they needed to brace themselves for an attack from all sides. Lyle would be trying to get in the house and probably try to kill all of them. Bryan told his father to barricade the doors and told his mother to close and lock all the window shutters. Both of them started lecturing him that he'd better remember his place in their home, and so Bryan and Jenny started barricading the doors and window shutters, while Bryan's parents lectured them both sternly about how great they were. Bryan was trying to ignore both parents so he could stay focused on trying to keep them alive, but he glanced up at his mother one time and did a double take. She was standing directly in front of, only an inch or two away from, a window, and was so full of her self-important lecture about how she must never be ordered around that she never noticed there was a 6.5 foot tall Dogman now standing directly behind her. It had very tall ears. Maybe you might want to say it was almost 7 feet tall if you count the ears. Either way, Bryan wished his mom would be anywhere else but right there. "Mom, get away from that window!" screamed Bryan in horror. His mother grew even more indignant. "Bryan, have you been listening to a single word I've been saying?" She began her standard pre-recorded, pre-scripted lecture about what an embarrassment he was and how disappointed she was in him, how he never lived up to her expectations, and how she often dreamed that she could go back in time and switch him with a different baby at the hospital. She didn't get very far into her standard speech this time, though, as the very tall werewolf reached his hand right through the window and grabbed Bryan's mom, pulling her right through the window and running off into the forest with her in what seemed like 4 or 5 leaps, more than it seemed like running. The two of them were in the forest before any of the humans could get to the window, and the most frightening part was that nobody could hear Bryan's mother screaming. She should have been screaming her head off. Bryan was terrified of what that might mean and hoped that she was only unconscious. He turned to Jenny. How is he able to be a werewolf in the day? How do I do it too? Jenny shook her head in confusion. Not only did she not have the answers, she didn't really understand the questions. Please call your mom, Bryan asked. Let's see if she knows. While calling her mom, Jenny asked Bryan why he wanted to know how to change into the wolf form, and Bryan's father answered before he could. How in hell is he supposed to get my wife back from that monster if he isn't transformed himself? Asked Bryan's dad, who clearly now had no further doubts that any of this was real. If that thing were human, I'd already be in the forest chasing it myself. We need something to even the odds here. Jenny's mom said she didn't know, and that even if she did, she might not share the information, as two werewolves were in no way better than one werewolf. Bryan in the Lycan form would be just as likely to hurt his mother as Lyle was. Bryan's father disagreed. He thought there was clear intention in Lyle's eyes when he abducted Bryan's mother. He seemed to know exactly what he was doing, and so Bryan's father suspected Bryan would instinctively act to rescue his mother, even in his Lycan form. Jenny's mom still was of a different opinion, but she said she would search her books and get back to him if she found anything. In the meantime, Bryan's mom was gone and time was wasting. We'll have to go after her as is, Dad, said Bryan, and they headed to the room where his father kept his hunting equipment. They each grabbed a capture air gun and loaded up on tranquilizer darts. Whoa, whoa, said Bryan's father. You're taking enough to tranquilize an elephant. Bryan took even more, saying, Then I'll need 3 times as many to tranquilize Lyle. Hearing the sound of glass breaking and his mother screaming upstairs, Bryan ran up to discover that the house was now under siege. Someone, presumably Lyle, was throwing rocks at the windows, breaking some of the glass but not so far getting through the wooden shutters. They would catch glimpses of the Dogman. It was remarkably fast for its huge size. It would throw a rock and begin running away before the stone even left its massive paw. It never remained in one spot long enough for Bryan or his father to line up a shot on him. He would never be in front of any one window long enough for it to become useful as a blind to attempt to tranquilize him from. Realizing they were losing this battle, Bryan called the cops. It probably should have been the first thing he did, but it's not always the first thing you think of when the guy you turned into a werewolf is bombarding your parents' home with stones. So Bryan told the cops that a crazy guy wearing a wolfman costume had abducted his mother and was trying to kill the rest of his family. It didn't sound like the woman on the other end believed him, so Bryan's father got on and repeated roughly the same story. Then the lady said she was sending out some cops and that he should stay on the line with her. When the sound of sirens began approaching from the distance, the sun had already started to go down. They had spent all day fighting Lyle, and soon Bryan would himself turn into the werewolf. Apparently, Lyle heard the siren because he was nowhere to be found when the police arrived. They made a cursory search of the property and took statements. They wanted my father to go with them to file a missing persons report on my mother, so he did, and Bryan set off walking with Jenny toward her home. The plan was to lock him in the basement, but neither Bryan nor Jenny were sure that was the right thing to do, what with Bryan's mother missing. Maybe Bryan needed to remain free tonight. It was very hard to figure out what would be the right thing to do. And then fate decided for the two of them. Bryan and Jenny both froze in place as they heard the chilling sound of a very large wolf howling. Then, without any warning, they heard an unmistakable growling coming from nearby, but from where? They couldn't be certain. They were walking down a suburban street. There were houses on both sides of the road and no traffic, either in cars or pedestrian, anywhere. The growling echoed and seemed to be coming from everywhere all around them at once. It was a deep kind of sound, deeper than a normal, natural animal growl. This was a kind of vibration you feel in your belly, and you could feel it at the bottom of your feet too. This was a sound that would be distracting even if it weren't already associated with large man-eating predators. This was not just a frightening growl. This was a supernaturally frightening growl. Bryan and Jenny locked eyes, and they each knew instantly that the other didn't have any idea what to do either. So they both stopped walking and turned slowly in a circle back to each other's back. No matter if they turned east, south, north, or west, it always sounded like that sound was right where they were. Or maybe as though it were. Looking up, Jenny screamed in horror. There it was, or rather, there Lyle was. He wasn't just up in the tree above them. He was way up in the tree above them, so high that his massive Dogman form was actually bending the main trunk of the old oak tree to the side. Bryan lost his temper and cursed. Jenny looked at him with new eyes, having never heard him swear before. But those new eyes saw something else far more surprising and horrifying. Bryan jerked sideways and let out a groan of sharp pain. Jenny could hear his bones cracking and watched as his nose cartilage reformed in new, more canine ways. Bryan fell backwards and sideways onto the sidewalk, moaning like something left dying on the ground. But Jenny knew this wasn't death she was witnessing. She had seen it before, and she knew it was more akin to a kind of rebirth. Jenny knelt on the ground next to Bryan and put her hands under his head. She could see that he still had humanity in his eyes, so she looked at him, or rather she looked at his human soul through his eyes, and she whispered one word to him. Remember. Then this lovely and charming, intelligent and resourceful young woman kissed the hideously transforming beast in front of her as though she were kissing her fairy prince. Bryan transformed fully into the beast, but his eyes did not complete the transformation. When Jenny next looked at him, she saw a werewolf with human understanding. It was a shocking moment of communication between beings that were never supposed to be able to connect. They had changed the way reality was supposed to behave through the conscious exercise of their wills. Bryan didn't need a spell to give him control over his lycanthropy. He didn't need a drug or a potion or therapy. He just needed a true friend. He needed something to fight for and something to defend. With a loud thud, like a Mack truck landing from space, Lyle, the immense Dogman, landed on the sidewalk, cracking it in several places and causing a reverberation that literally bounced Bryan and Jenny up off the sidewalk for a split second. And that was the same amount of time it took for Bryan's werewolf form to be on its feet and ready for battle with its dog-headed rival. Looking forward, Bryan's human eyes saw the belly of the werewolf Lyle. Looking up, he saw Lyle's claws, each of them the size of his torso. Looking up even further, he saw the drooling maw of the 8-foot-tall dog that had once been the creep who beat Bryan up back in school. And if he didn't either beat this monster now, or at the very least ward off the attack, then Jenny was going to end up the same as his mother, wherever she was. Bryan's canine body tensed in emotional pain, thinking about what Lyle might have done to his mother, and he realized Lyle was destroying life after life for no good reason, and he, Bryan, was the only one in the world who had a chance to stop him. One time, Bryan was in his werewolf form and fought Lyle in his human form. Lyle won. So for that reason, Bryan is not feeling especially confident right now, and his limited wolf-like intelligence is frantically looking for a way out of this situation. But before he could think of anything to do, Lyle picked him up and held him up over his head, arms fully extended. Jenny screamed at Lyle to stop, but he ignored her and threw Bryan through the air into the forest. Grabbing hold of a tree as he flew past, Bryan swung around in a full circle and boomeranged toward Lyle, kicking him hard in the chest. It was an impressive move, by far the most athletic thing that Bryan had ever done in his life. It also made little impact at all, since Bryan barely seemed to have even been bothered by it. Jenny kept shouting at Lyle for him to stop, and he brushed her away casually. It was casual for him anyway, but Jenny fell backward and landed somewhat ungracefully, hurting her left elbow as she dropped. Enraged at the treatment Jenny was receiving, Bryan tore into Lyle in a furious attack, far more fierce than any savage animal in that forest. He landed blow after blow on Lyle, who withstood them all as though he were battling a small child. Then, when Bryan seemed done, Lyle hauled off and belted him so hard he went staggering backward. As soon as he got up, Bryan ran. He ran toward the highway. He couldn't win. He had to get away and give Jenny a chance to escape as well. Bryan ran out onto the highway, and a car came around the turn at too fast a speed. It swerved wildly, trying to miss Bryan, and in doing so, accidentally smashed hard into Lyle. The front end of the car was crushed to bits, with glass, metal, and plastic all over the pavement. The force of that impact would have taken out any animal that lives in America. Heck, it would have taken out most jungle animals too. The driver of the car got out to see what he had hit. His eyes fell on Lyle's hairy and huge form laying on the sidewalk, and the driver asked out loud, "Did I just kill a bear?" With a sudden rush of adrenaline, Lyle, in his werewolf form, rose up furiously off the asphalt and bellowed at the poor man. He ran back into his car and started backing away at 30 or 40 miles per hour. Lyle looked around for Bryan and Jenny, but he didn't see them anywhere. That was all right. He knew where they lived. Meanwhile, Bryan and Jenny were in the process of running away. Bryan had picked Jenny up and started running toward her house, but Jenny stopped him. "That's the first place Lyle would look for us," Jenny told Bryan, then showed him what direction to run to get to Lyle's house. Bryan looked at Jenny quizzically. Lyle's house? Why would they want to go there? Of course, that might be where Lyle put Bryan's mother. Maybe if they got to her in time, she might still be all right. Bryan, like a good dog, followed Jenny's directions and carried her until they reached the grounds of a huge mansion. Is this where Lyle lived? This was the largest house Bryan had ever seen. He didn't even know this place was there, and he had been living in this area his entire life. Although very large and impressive, as they walked closer and closer, the mansion appeared to be in a bit of disrepair, and also seemed as though it might be abandoned. Jenny knew Bryan must be filled with questions, so she started explaining to him. Lyle's parents went away a few years ago and left him in charge of the mansion and the servants. He had let all the servants go and managed everything by himself, and so the place looked in need of a little fixing up. Jenny's story left Bryan more confused than before. Lyle's parents left him alone for years? Why did he fire his servants? A number of things about the story just didn't hold water, but Bryan figured that when he was human again, it would probably make more sense. Jenny tried the front door and found it locked. She started telling Bryan her plan for jimmying the door open using her daddy's credit card, but before she could finish her sentence, Bryan had leaped through one of the house's windows, smashing glass everywhere. He had already searched 3 rooms before Jenny had managed to climb inside without cutting herself. After exploring what seemed like the entire ground floor, they found nothing, and Bryan was growing agitated. Jenny remembered that there was an east wing to the mansion. She grabbed Bryan by his large, dangerous claw and began to lead him there. Rounding a corner, they came into a lovely old room, decorated with Victorian furnishings and a lit fireplace. There was an elegantly dressed middle-aged lady sitting facing away from them, enjoying the fire and rocking slowly. She appeared to be drinking brandy from a snifter. Jenny had no idea who this was. No middle-aged women were supposed to be living in Lyle's house. Had his mother come home? Calling out tentatively, Jenny asked, "Excuse me?" And the woman turned around suddenly. It was Bryan's mother. Why was she dressed like that? What was she doing? Bryan walked over to her and then remembered he was a monster. Not wanting to frighten his mother, he backed off, but she didn't seem frightened of him in the least. Jenny ran over and hugged her, asking if she was okay. Bryan's mom seemed unnaturally calm, and a wide smile crept across her face. "Why, Jenny, my dear, I've never felt better. We were so worried we didn't know what Lyle might have done to you, but it seems he didn't do anything at all." Bryan's mom started laughing. Jenny chuckled along too, but Bryan's mom didn't stop laughing, and Jenny began to feel a bit uncomfortable. "What's so funny?" she asked. "I'm surprised you think Lyle did nothing to me," Bryan's mom giggled, then sipped her brandy some more. "Why, Lyle has given me a great gift, she said. And now, Jenny darling, I'm going to share that gift with you. Horrifically, Bryan's mom collapsed to the ground loudly. Jenny screamed in horror at the unnatural thing she had just witnessed. What was going on here? None of this made any sense. Then, gyrating madly on the floor, Bryan's mother's bones began making cracking sounds. Her face twisted grotesquely, and Jenny realized what was happening. Lyle had made Bryan's mother into a werewolf. She was now loyal not to her son, who she didn't even seem to recognize, but to Lyle. Jenny's stomach sickened. How could she have ever thought she loved Lyle? Get us out of here, she commanded Bryan, who was almost entirely of a canine mind by that point. The longer he stayed in werewolf form, the more muddled his thinking became. He grabbed Jenny and carried her out the front door of the house, leaving behind the woman he now no longer understood was his human mother. Running in whatever direction Jenny told him to, Bryan was completely unaware of the fact that his mom was running after them, and she had already contacted Lyle. Bryan believes it is his own fault that Lyle became a wolfman in the first place, so his already muddled werewolf mind has gone on shutdown, and he's just doing what Jenny tells him to at this point. Bryan, in his werewolf form, is physically and emotionally exhausted. He carries Jenny through the woods wherever she asks, but his steps get slower and he grows more confused and tired until he staggers to a halt, gently places Jenny down right on top of the dividing line in the center of the highway, then drops to the floor in utter unconsciousness and begins to snore. Jenny knows the danger they're in and wants to wake him, but sees his body begin twitching, and she knows he's transforming back to his human form. He'll remain human until the next full moon, but would Lyle? Would Bryan's mother? They seemed to somehow have the ability to transform at will, and to remain in the form even during daylight hours. Were they going to be like this permanently? And how could she and Bryan hide from creatures with supernatural tracking abilities? That thought reminded Jenny that they were exposed out in the open, and she was going to have to wait till Bryan transformed before beginning to try to wake him up. He might need to sleep for hours. She got up and looked around, finding nothing she could bring over to hide him. She did notice an oddly shaped rock with a concave area on the bottom on one side. It would be large enough for Bryan to sleep in, but she didn't know if she could drag him. He wasn't the biggest guy, but she wasn't the biggest girl either. The concave area was partially hidden, and it was the closest thing she could find to a hiding spot. So she went back to see how Bryan was. When she reached the middle of the highway, she saw he was completely human again, and completely asleep as well. She put his head in her hands and tried to wake him. He was more than asleep. He was exhausted, and she knew he needed at least some sleep before he would be strong enough even to wake up. After several attempts to drag him failed, Jenny gave up and decided to keep him warm the only way she knew how. Laying down next to him, right on the highway, Jenny hugged his unconscious form and wrapped one leg over him, acting like a human bed cover. If she kept her ear to the ground, she could hear if a car was coming and hopefully get up in time to stop the driver from running them over. It was dangerous, but what other option did she have? Bryan had done so much for her. This was the least she could do for him. That was the way she felt about it. There was no other aspect to her doing this. But when she looked at Bryan, laying there, passed out, she felt an enormous connection to him, as well as a feeling of belonging that was very different from that she felt with her mom at home. Something about him was different, and she realized he was for her, and she was for him. Jenny kissed Bryan on the forehead gently and felt that somehow things were going to turn out all right. "Well, isn't this a lovely scene?" came a mocking voice behind her. She thought it was a man's voice and didn't recognize it. Turning around, however, she was met with the form of another one of these werewolves. This one seemed distinctly female in ways that YouTube would rather you just imagine for yourself. It was taller than Bryan when he was in werewolf form, but not as tall as Lyle. Jenny looked around for who had spoken but saw no one else. "Who said that?" asked Jenny, eyeing the woods. "Don't be rude, child," came the response from the Lycan form in front of her. "And please, stop pawing at my son." It hit Jenny like a mule kicking her in the head that this was Bryan's mother, and that she was speaking English. Her voice sounded deeper. The way she acted was different too. She had an arrogant and noble air about her, not the pleasant and friendly one Jenny was used to. Was she possessed? But if she were, she wouldn't refer to Bryan as her son. Why was she acting so differently? And how was she able to speak? When her initial shock and confusion waned enough for her to formulate speech again, Jenny asked the fur-covered, 6-foot-tall, wolf-like yet humanoid form in front of her that last question out loud. How was she able to speak when she was in her werewolf form? This drew more mocking laughter from the hairy thing. "You must be so confused," she giggled. "Poor dear. You probably still think Bryan caused Lyle's werewolfism, don't you?" "It's called lycanthropy," Jenny sneered back, disliking being mocked. Ignoring her, the canine that used to be Bryan's mother continued. "Lyle got his lycanthropy in the same way he's gotten everything, darling. He inherited it." "Shut up, you old cow," came a voice from way over all their heads. "I don't remember asking you to tell my personal history to anyone." The voice shook the ground as it resonated, yet hurt the ears with its roughness. Lyle. It had to be Lyle. He was hidden by the darkness, but he was undeniably here now. Jenny's heart beat hard and fast, and she began shivering as though she were freezing. She looked at Bryan and saw that he was still too out of it to be able to get up and run. She could try to save herself, or she could stay here and try to bargain to protect Bryan. Then, stepping onto the road, came the thick-legged, overly muscled, tall-eared, yellow-eyed monstrosity that Jenny used to call her boyfriend Lyle. "You," he said, "come and kneel before me." He pointed at the ground in front of his feet, and Jenny was scurrying there before he had finished pointing. "If you beg forgiveness sincerely enough, I may allow you to serve me," it told her, adding, "However, even if your apology is perfection itself, I may still decide to tear your heart out." What a jerk. Jenny knew she didn't have a choice if she wanted to try to protect Bryan. He might, like he said, still kill her anyway, but if she didn't comply to his stupid, egomaniac commands, then he certainly would. After she apologized enough to amuse the two inhuman creatures, Lyle made her swear eternal allegiance to him 3 times over. She swore that she would never be more loyal to any other than to him. The entire time, she was doing the internal version of rolling her eyes at his supposed commands. Jenny had been told that she couldn't be hypnotized, but she did her best not to let on that it wasn't really working on her. Lyle commanded Bryan's mother to bring his unconscious form over to him on the grass on the side of the road. He sniffed at Bryan's body lying there snoring and drooling. "As much as I dislike him, I can find some use for him," he announced out loud. As for the girl, his thoughts trailed off, and he looked Jenny over. She jumped almost a foot in the air when the meaning of Lyle's pause took hold inside her. He must have figured out that the hypnosis wasn't working. He was going to kill her now. Jenny ran into the street, watching behind her as the two wolf-headed monster people ran out after her. Now, all three of them were running down the road, and Bryan was behind them somewhere on the grass, asleep. Jenny had thought Lyle might let her live, yet kill Bryan. It turned out his plan was the opposite of that. Jenny was hyperventilating and started to panic. She cried so much that it was hard for her to see. Still, she ran as quickly as she could. She found that being so cold from fear actually helped her run faster. It warmed up the body to run. She had nothing better to do than run, here in these last few moments of her life. Time slowed down, and Jenny realized it was a lot of fun to run, and she was gonna miss it after she was gone. Every single aspect of her consciousness became precious to her, even her aching legs and feet and lungs. She heard loud collisions and screaming behind her. She saw a light coming from behind her. Jenny realized that the Dogman might not get a chance to kill her. She was apparently about to be run over from behind by a car. Turning and seeing nothing but headlights filling her entire vision, Jenny's nervous system went on overload and she fainted, dropping forward and down right onto the asphalt. When she woke up, she was in the back seat of a car that was driving somewhere. It was raining hard, so she couldn't really tell what time of day it was or even where she was. There were two people in the front seat of the car, and she was stunned to see Bryan was in the seat beside her. Was that Lyle and Bryan's mother driving the car? Jenny tried to clear her head and her vision, and the person in the passenger seat noticed that she had stirred. Turning around, she was amazed to see the smiling face of her mother, not Bryan's mother. Wait, had Lyle gotten Jenny's mother too? She screamed in shock and horror, causing Bryan to wake up with a start, utterly confused as to what was going on. Jenny was crying. This nightmare kept getting worse and worse, and now she had lost her mother to it. The driver shouted out, "Hey, no crying back there. We're the good guys, remember?" It was Bryan's dad. This woke Bryan up further, and he and his father expressed how happy they were to see each other. They both exhibited a great sense of relief, which still confused Jenny, who was in fight or flight mode. "It's okay, Jenny," said her mom. "Well, at least so far. We got you away from those two, and you're going to be safe once we work a few things out. I would tell you the way Bryan's father knocked the werewolves down, but I don't think you two would like me talking about it." Jenny's mom and Bryan's dad explained as they drove that they had looked into Lyle's background, and his family seems to have had some very dark, yet very powerful, connections for quite some time. Being their enemy was a death sentence. It was like getting the mafia mad at you. Now when that happens, when the mob gets mad at you, the feds set you up in the witness protection program. But what happens if you make enemies with the meanest people in the government and corporate worlds? Then you go to an entirely different organization of people in order to change and protect your identity. Bryan couldn't believe what he was hearing. Changing their identity? Because of Lyle? The idea of it seemed stupid to him. Now that they had regrouped, all they needed was a plan of attack, and they could find some way to defeat him. He was certain of it. Bryan's dad and Jenny's mom explained that Bryan had not been the cause of Lyle's ability to transform into a Lycan. He came from a long line of them. And in fact, it was more likely that Bryan had been bitten by a member of Lyle's clan than the other way around. But they are descended from the original breed. They aren't really human. They've interbred with the most powerful people in the world over generations. They are 3 times more powerful than an ordinary werewolf like Bryan. They can transform whenever they want for one thing. They can think and speak while in the other form for another. They can smell you from a mile away. And because of Lyle's family connections, they have access to resources that can locate one needle in a million haystacks. No, Bryan and Jenny needed new identities and new lives. But what about my transformations? Bryan asked, and Jenny's mom urged him to be calm. They were working out every necessary angle. Jenny asked about her new identity and was told they didn't know what it was yet. Bryan and Jenny would be staying together, but Jenny's mom and Bryan's dad were going to have to keep quite a distance for everyone's sake. All 4 of them together would be geometrically easier for their enemies to spot. No, when they reached their drop-off point, it was going to be goodbye for Jenny and Bryan with their parents for quite some time. Jenny wasn't taking this very well, and she was beginning to have an emotional fit. "Don't worry," Jenny's mom whispered. "You know I will be watching out for you at all times through our connections, and I will contact you at times if I need to. We will see each other again." Bryan had just lost his mom in the weirdest way possible. And next he was going to be losing his father in the second weirdest way. He wished he could cry and hug his dad, but they didn't do that sort of stuff, so he just looked out the window and felt the crushing pain of the entire situation weighing on him until his head and neck ached from the massive weight of it all. "Can we at least know where we're going?" Bryan asked in a weak voice. "To the one city that Lyle's family owns the least property and interest in," answered Jenny's mom. "And that is?" asked Jenny. "That is," answered Jenny's mom, "New York City." Jenny left the office far later than usual. She was exhausted, but at least she had gotten her work done for the day, and she could sleep secure, knowing that her boss would be happy in the morning. She texted Bryan that she was leaving, and he texted back that he'd have dinner ready for her as soon as she got home. So much had changed so quickly in their lives, and yet it all seemed so natural somehow. She thought of him under his new name far more than she thought of him under his old one. Jenny had taken the idea of changing identities far harder than Bryan had initially. But walking along the empty sidewalk heading for the subway, listening to her heels clacking on the concrete and echoing in the man-made canyon all around her, Jenny realized she loved her new life. Maybe because she had been given this job as a cover and never really had to spend years in college preparing for it and working toward it, she viewed it more as a video game than anything else and didn't stress too badly about work problems. After all, there was nothing that could happen at work that could be half as frightening as running into her old ex-boyfriend Lyle in his immense werewolf form out in the forest. Jenny had spent her entire life in the woods, but now she was terrified of them. She had become a complete city girl in very little time. She had long fingernails, for one thing. She dressed up every day. And she had Bryan. Down in the subway, waiting for the train, Jenny began remembering what it was like to feel afraid. Why was there nobody else on the platform? How late could it be? She checked her phone. It was only a little after 10, so why did it seem like it was 3 in the morning? Why was there not a person in the booth? She was the only human in the entire station, and that scared her. Then she realized she should be more worried if she weren't the only person there, since she wasn't going to mug herself. Again, seeing the light side of things, Jenny relaxed and smiled to herself. In less than an hour, she'd be back in Brooklyn, eating some culinary masterpiece a la Chef Bryan. She had nothing to fear or complain about, nothing in the world. Seeing a light in the distance in the tunnel, Jenny did a little celebration jump. That was her train coming. She would be out of this haunted dungeon of a train station soon. Then, Jenny heard a sound that was at once strange and yet familiar. It was coming from her right, so it was not the approaching train, which was to her left. Turning, Jenny could see no one else on the platform, but she could still hear the sound. What was it? It sounded like something growling at her. Then she noticed lights in the darkness of the tracks. Somewhere down the tunnel were small lights. No, they weren't lights. They were eyeshine. With sickening speed, the eyeshine moved forward, running into the light, and revealing itself to be the eyes of the very same ex-boyfriend werewolf that Jenny had just been congratulating herself on escaping. Jenny ran away from the thing that she once loved. She ran down the track as fast as she could in her heels, which was not fast. Behind her, she saw Lyle climbing onto the track. He was laughing. Jenny ran down the platform as the train pulled in beside her. She didn't see anyone on any of the cars, and with horror, she wondered if it might be out of service. Maybe it wasn't going to stop at all. But then it began slowing. Jenny looked behind her to see where Lyle was, but she couldn't see him anywhere. Did he leave the station? Did he jump back on the tracks? She couldn't see him in any direction, so she stopped running and caught her breath, waiting for the train to pull into the station. Looking through the windows as cars passed by, she still didn't notice any passengers. The car she got onto had 2 people in it, though. Both of them sat toward the back, facing away from her. It made her feel a little safer. Jenny couldn't wait to get home to Bryan. Suddenly, the car rocked in a way that Jenny was entirely unfamiliar with. She watched out of the windows and noticed that the tunnel seemed unfamiliar. There was no light outside, a fact made more severely obvious when the train's internal lights began flickering. The train seemed to pick up in speed and soon was traveling through a tunnel brightly lit with red lights. Don't red lights mean to slow down? Yet the train was clearly speeding up. The car was rocking so hard that Jenny fell out of her seat. Hard. She looked over at the 2 other passengers in embarrassment, hoping they hadn't seen that. Both of them, in unison, turned around to look at her. She was about to give them an oops or an I'm okay when she looked up at their faces. It was Lyle, her ex-boyfriend, and he was with Bryan's mom. Then, at once, they both began to gyrate and twitch, and she knew they were about to transform into their hairy, vicious, deadly Lycan form. Jenny screamed. She screamed again. She screamed a 3rd time, and Bryan grabbed her, holding her tight. "It's okay, Jenny, it's okay. It was just a dream." Jenny looked around their darkened bedroom. It really had been a dream. She and Bryan were still safe. The past half year had been one of complete change for Jenny and Bryan. They hadn't actually finished high school, yet in their new identities, they were 21 years old and recent college graduates. Even harder to get used to at first was the fact that, in their new cover identities, they were married. Yeah, that's right. Married. They had no choice in the identities, living quarters, or their new jobs as office assistants in a large company. At first, they each slept separately, but Bryan had loved Jenny for some time, and after the first couple of months, you might say that romance bloomed. They got a local Wiccan priestess they had made friends with to perform a wedding ceremony, telling her that their first wedding hadn't been romantic enough. In reality, they were just given a marriage license with 2 names they didn't recognize on it and told to remember those names because now they were theirs. Bryan's 3 nights of the full moon were taken care of by him staying in a special cell in the basement of their building, too well fortified to be broken out of even by a werewolf like Bryan. For the most part, they were both happy. Jenny missed her mom. Bryan missed both his parents and his cat Mervyn, but they were both too busy just living their lives to spend too much time missing anyone or anything. The one dark part of their life was Jenny's nightmares. She dreamed about Lyle several times a week, and usually woke up screaming or crying or flailing about in bed as though she were fighting for her life. Bryan was very concerned about Jenny. The dreams usually involved her being stalked or attacked by Lyle while coming home from work alone. Bryan, who usually got let out at 5 p.m. by their boss, took to sitting and drinking coffee in a diner across the street from their office until Jenny would eventually get out. Neither of them were sure if their boss just thought Jenny was the more competent of the 2 of them, or if he just thought that she had nice legs and wanted to keep her around longer each day. Eventually, there came a night when Bryan had to get home to lock himself in his secretly prepared basement cell. If he didn't get there in time, he'd become a werewolf right there in New York City. In that form, he was fully feral, unless Jenny was around. She was sort of his Fey Ray. He would do what she wanted no matter what form he was in. Bryan texted Jenny his whereabouts, then closed and locked the cell door, leaving his cell phone outside. He would be out of contact until Jenny let him out in the morning. Jenny got Bryan's text a couple of hours later as she left her office. Stepping outside, she was hit with a cold breeze and pulled her jacket closed tight. Looking around, she was struck by the realization that there was nobody there. Manhattan, with an empty street, is creepy. Every street normally has activity 24/7. Walking down an empty New York street can feel a bit like you're walking around after World War III. Jenny shivered, as much because of the cold breeze making her wish she'd worn a pantsuit as because of the déjà vu gripping her. This was exactly how her dreams usually started. Sighing heavily to get her courage up, Jenny began the walk to the subway station. Her heels clacked down the street. Rounding a corner, a rat ran across her foot, squealing as it blindly made its way back into the sewer and disappeared inside. Jenny was so upset she began crying. Disappointed in herself, she remembered that she was the same girl who used to go hunting with her uncle and her grandpa. They would both be unhappy to see her afraid of rats like some spoiled city girl, but that was what she'd become. She'd adapted to survive in her new environment. Jenny paused under a streetlight and took out her mirror to fix her makeup, which was being ruined by her tears. That was when she heard it. That same sound from her dream. Something was growling at her. Something canine. That isn't supposed to happen until I'm in the subway, she thought, then reminded herself, this wasn't a dream. Looking around frantically, Jenny caught a familiar silhouette and immediately thought she was seeing a Dogman. That Dogman. Just as in her dreams. Had Lyle found them? Frozen in horror, Jenny watched the silhouette move through the shadows. It wasn't moving toward her. It was moving parallel to her. What was it doing? It was stalking a cat. A beautiful orange cat was eating something that somebody had left out for it, and that silhouette was stalking it. Unable to help herself, Jenny called out to the cat, who got frightened and ran off. Now, for the first time, the silhouette turned toward her. Its eyes glowed orange in the dark. Then it stepped into the light. Jenny was looking at a red-furred, savage-looking, fox-like Dogman. It had to be 6 foot tall or taller. Its tall, white ears were tipped in black and was foaming at the mouth as though it were diseased. This was not Lyle. This was not anything she had seen before, but it had seen her now, and it was angry. Jenny took a step backward. That thing took a step forward. And now, the all-new episode of Bryan's Lycan Troubles. Jenny turned and ran. She didn't know where she was going. She just knew she didn't want to be where she was. Flying around the corner, intending to head toward the subway, Jenny ran straight into the arms of a humanoid figure much taller than she was. The strong arms of the entity closed around Jenny, and she screamed and fought to get away. Ouch, hey lady, don't kick a person. I was just catching you before you tripped on that crack on the sidewalk. Jenny found herself released. Looking up, she saw that she was talking to a police officer. Jenny turned and saw the giant bipedal fox still heading in her direction. The cop saw her expression and pulled her behind him. He drew his gun and turned the corner quick. "Stop! Police!" he shouted. "Get your hands in the—" It was at that point that the officer noticed that the alleged perpetrator didn't have any hands. What he had might be better described as paws, or maybe claws. Almost dropping his gun, the cop picked Jenny up like she was a sack of potatoes and threw her over his shoulder. Then he beat it back to the station house a few blocks away. He put Jenny down outside the police station, and the two of them caught their breath. "Do you need me to file a report?" Jenny asked. The officer realized she had said something and asked her to repeat it. Jenny asked again if he needed her to fill out any paperwork or answer any questions. The cop's head was spinning, and it took him a while to process what she had asked him. He did have questions for her, such as, what did they both just see? He was pretty sure it would be bad for his career if he reported a monster in Manhattan, but equally as sure that the monster was likely to hurt or even kill someone if something wasn't done about it. His heart was torn between doing what was right and doing what would ensure he could afford to retire. He chose a third path. "Look," he said, staring Jenny directly in the eye. "My name is Pat. Can I buy you a cup of coffee so we can discuss what just happened off the record?" Jenny was taken aback by the invitation and literally stood with her mouth open. I just want to make sure we both saw the same thing. I can't report it unless I can prove it's real. I'll lose my job." Jenny still didn't like the idea of it. "Look, I'll make sure you get driven home by a cop after we talk, okay?" Jenny said if she could take a picture of him and his badge and text them to her landlord first, then she would be cool with it. Jenny started walking in the direction of the all-night Drunken Donuts nearby, and the cops stopped her and took her to a much cooler place with much fewer people. They chose a booth in the back and ordered some coffee. The conversation was brief. Jenny was paranoid the entire time. She had seen movies about police in the big cities, but This guy Pat seemed sincere enough so far. She didn't tell him anything about Bryan. She just told him what she'd seen that night. A red fox, bigger than any ever seen before, and it was walking on its hind legs. She told him the bit about how it had been stalking an alley cat, and that was all she had to report. Then she began asking him what he knew. She could tell by the look in his eyes that Pat was surprised she had asked, and it seemed he was holding something back. "It's not a matter of police record, is it?" she asked, and he had to shake his head no. "Did you see something, Pat?" she asked, allowing their hands to sit next to each other, touching. "Do you know something more about this than what you—" She couldn't finish her question as the waitress screamed and dropped a plate on the floor. She was staring out the front window, and soon everyone's gaze had turned in the same direction. There, out on the empty street, was a monster. It was that same monster, that giant, red, bipedal, feral fox thing, and it had its face pressed to the glass, looking in. Jenny and Pat the cop stared unbelieving as the large, hairy, fox-headed man stared in at them through the diner window. They had been foolish to think they were safe. That thing was feral, and it was out to get them. Jenny knew what was going to happen next. Pat was going to throw her over his shoulders again like a sack of potatoes and run out. Jenny ran as quickly as she could out the back door before he could grab her, making sure to stay at least a few paces in front of him. The back exit of the diner led to a lobby which led to the next avenue over. Pat called for backup on his walkie-talkie. The two of them made it out to the street as a cop car pulled up. Pat told the other car to take Jenny home and send reinforcements. Pat went to leave, but Jenny called him back and gave him her ID, asking him to let her know what happened. The next morning, Jenny had breakfast ready before unlocking Bryan's cage. She wasn't able to sleep well at all that night, trying to decide how to tell Bryan about what happened. She wasn't exactly sure herself what had happened. When Bryan came upstairs, he was surprised at the breakfast smells. That was usually his job. After he had a couple of sips of coffee and was a little more awake, Jenny told him she had seen a werewolf the night before. "Did it see you?" he asked, adding another question before she could answer. "Was it Lyle?" "No, yes," she answered, a bit overwhelmed. "Yes, it saw me, but no, I don't think it was Lyle." "Was it working for Lyle? Did it follow you home?" No, she cried. I don't know." Jenny descended into tears and Bryan held her. "There was a cop," she said, between sobbing. "He saw it too. He got me out of there and got another cop to drive me home." "Wow," said Bryan, standing up and walking around the kitchen, trying to make sense of everything. Jenny said she was going to take the day off that day. She advised Bryan to as well, and said they should get out of town, at least until the full moon was over. Bryan thought about it. If one of Lyle's agents had found Jenny, then they would not only need to move, they would need new cover identities. And if that wasn't an agent of Lyle's, then what exactly was it? How many different kinds of Lycans could possibly be living in an area as urban as New York City? Jenny interrupted his thoughts. "If you're worried about not being locked up when you transform, remember, I can control your actions. You always behave for me, remember?" "Huh?" asked Bryan. "I wasn't actually thinking of that, but it's a good point to bring up. Just because you've been able to control the Lycan in me so far doesn't mean you always will." "Oh, come on," said Jenny, picking up the dishes. "You're getting close to being able to control the wolf yourself. You told me you even remember all the stuff that happens while—" "I said I'm beginning to remember parts of being a werewolf," interrupted Bryan. "That's not the same as having the beast under control." Jenny knew he was right, but she tickled him to change the subject. "We get to take the day off. We're going to have a road trip. So turn that frown upside down, Mr. Cranky Pants." One of the few items her mom had gifted to Jenny when they parted company was the lease and keys to a cabin in the woods. Her mom told her she had purchased it under an alias in the hopes that nobody would trace it back to its true owners and that Jenny and Bryan could use it as a backup hideout. Jenny hadn't even told Bryan about it, having been advised to be as secret about the place as she possibly could be. As they drove to the cabin, Jenny had a strange feeling that something unexpected was going on. As they pulled up in front of the place, Bryan asked her if she was really sure that someone wasn't already in there. There was no other car parked nearby, and there seemed to be no lights on inside. Yet still, both of them had the gut feeling that someone else was there. Bryan asked Jenny to keep driving, but she pulled the car over and parked instead. Then she got out, walked to the front door, and turned to look at Bryan, who was still sitting in the passenger seat. He thought for a second about letting her go in there alone, but obviously he wasn't going to do that. Making an annoyed grunt, Bryan got out of the car and slammed the door behind him, marching as loudly as he could up the front porch. He banged loudly on the front door. "Anyone in there?" he asked in the deepest voice he could manage. No response at all came from inside. Bryan shrugged his shoulders and Jenny stuck her key in the lock, opening the door easily. This must be the place, they both said at the same time, but neither of them laughed about it. After scouting around and finding nobody else there, they brought all their stuff inside, and Bryan started making dinner. Almost immediately, though, his body began to twitch and gyrate. All thoughts of preparing a meal left his head, replaced with the urge to hunt for his dinner. Jenny had sounded sure each time she assured Bryan that she would be able to control him that night and the next without the aid of his usual high-security cell. Now that they were out there in the middle of nowhere and she had nothing to defend herself with if Bryan chose to attack her, Jenny felt the fear and adrenaline course through her veins, as though her hemoglobin had been mixed with Red Bull. This wasn't the kind of fear that petrifies a person. This was the kind of fear that causes your hands to shake and makes you stutter. This was the kind of fear when you know you're placing yourself at risk of losing your life. Jenny had never felt frightened watching Bryan transform before. She couldn't explain why, but she always felt comfortable with him. Not this time. This time, watching him twitch and gyrate and grow hair all over sickened Jenny's stomach. This time, she needed to look away. Why did she feel so frightened and so nauseated? "It is a revolting display, isn't it?" asked a deep voice out of nowhere. Jenny jumped and looked around. There was nobody there. And then there was Lyle, Jenny's ex-boyfriend, the guy they were on the run from, the entire reason they had to change their identities in the first place. He had been there, but just not let them see him. "How did you find us?" Jenny asked. "How did you even know about my mother's cabin?" she demanded to know. "I don't know anything about your mother's cabin, Jenny. This is my cabin." Jenny was utterly confused. "Don't you remember?" Lyle taunted her. Now, bits and pieces of it started coming back to her. Her mother had never given her the key to this cabin. Lyle had. Back when he was pretending to hypnotize her. Jenny clearly remembered thinking that the hypnosis hadn't worked. She looked at Bryan. His transformation would soon be complete. Maybe together, once he was a werewolf, the two of them could somehow escape Lyle. "You can't escape me," Lyle said as though he had read her mind. "I told you that already. I told you that you would never betray me, and I meant it. Now, tell your puppy dog to kneel before me." Tell him that I am now his new master." Jenny laughed inside. Lyle actually thought she was under his control. Good. Then she still had the element of surprise on her side. "Bryan?" Jenny commanded him. "Bryan!" She had his attention. "Look, Bryan, look. There's Lyle." Bryan looked and began to growl. Jenny continued. "Bryan, Lyle is your new master. Bow down before your new master, Bryan." Jenny felt a sense of triumph. She looked at Lyle's expression. Ha! She could never be controlled by him. She had sure shown him. Then she took her place beside Bryan, and the two of them worshipped their new werewolf master. In the description of this video, we've got a link to our new Scary Stories t-shirt. It's our classic skull logo, and it says Scary Stories underneath in the kaiju monster font. It comes in black and also black and other dark colors, such as black. Good for ladies or gentlemen, hoodies too, whatever you need. Oh, I also should plug the new Those American Girls album. It's got Madeline Starr on it and Patricia Howdigi and Colleen Great, and all the songs are written by Those American Girls. This one has no cover tracks on it. The title is Those American Girls Turn Off the TV, and you can get it from the link or links in the description.
Come back for more scary stories.